But suddenly calling it an emergency is the legal basis for being able to impose, without any congressional involvement at all, sweeping tariffs on nearly every single country on planet Earth.
So tariffs are supposed to be the domain of Congress. They're not supposed to belong to the White House and the president. The only way the president is allowed to take control of tariffs are through these emergency measures that were granted to him by Congress.
The fact of the matter is, over the years, Congress has passed all sorts of laws authorizing all sorts of actions in response to all sorts of emergencies, give or take. So a creative and determined president can find some statutory warrant for doing just about whatever he wants to do.
And I should point out, I've only mentioned so far a very small number of all the times Trump has invoked emergency powers as a means of getting things done with as little discussion and oversight as possible. Journalists at the Associated Press have tracked how often past presidents have cited the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act over the course of their terms. Here's George W. Bush's first term. And keep in mind, he was president during the 9/11 attack. Here's his second term. Barack Obama's first term looks like this, explained in part because he presided over the worst economic disaster since the Great Depression. And here is his second term. And then here's Trump's first term and Biden's only term. Layer them all on top of each other and you start to notice a trend. But then look at the first few months of Trump's second term. This is why I've seen some media call this the 911 presidency, where the use of emergency powers has become central to governing.
What we're seeing with Trump and this continual declaration of emergency after emergency is just an ongoing increase of presidential power with very little interest from other branches in checking that power.
This is of a piece with what many folks see as a slide in America's democratic standings.
Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that Trump is the only president who has ever stretched the definition of an emergency. You may remember, for example, when Joe Biden tried to cancel more than $400 billion worth of federal student debt using the COVID national emergency that was already in place as justification. The US Supreme Court would later decide, you can't do that. But most experts agree Trump has taken this approach to a whole new level.
Other presidents have, invoked emergency authority, sometimes in circumstances where there was a lot of dispute as to whether there was an actual emergency or not. What I think sets Trump apart is that is where he starts. He starts with, these things are emergencies, therefore extraordinary use of my powers as president are justified and necessary.
Now, Trump's administration has said on many occasions now,
the president was right to declare a national emergency when it came to fentanyl and when it came to our crippling deficits and the lack of critical supply chains here at home.
It drives home, how much of a national emergency we're in, that we've lost critical skills, and we weren't even aware that we had lost those skills until a few months ago.
But what actually constitutes an emergency? How do you define one? That's not really laid out in law.
When you look at the statutes, it doesn't really define clearly what a threat to national security is. And so the president has all the power to decide what exactly that means.
I think when these laws were being written, Congress was expecting that future presidents would use these powers carefully and solemnly. If Spain decides to invade Florida, we want the president to be able to react quickly, and we don't want to tie his hands with lots of procedures and process and that sort of thing.
So here's the bottom line. There is no shortage of opinionated people out there who believe this is part of a rapid descent into authoritarianism, the erosion of American democracy, a sign of dark times ahead. Or, for Trump's most vocal supporters, this is simply a man who has identified a series of problems and is getting things done. But one thing has been made clear. Until a court or Congress decides to rein in this unchecked power, an emergency is really only one thing. It's what the president says it is, whether that's Trump or whomever comes after him.
We didn't ask for this fight.
In this rapidly changing world,
Canada will fight back.
Canadians are faced with new challenges both at home,
$13 bag of grapes, ridiculous,
and abroad.
I say you can always become a state.
Now, more than ever, it is important to stay informed.
About tariffs, tariffs are their own punishment.
Get the answers you need.
This is how Trump
operates from the source you can trust.
I'm Adrienne Arsenault.
The National, Canada's newscast.
Why is Paris always burning?
Why do they have to pay $50 million?
It is now believed that Titan was destroyed. What do we know?
They're gonna have to pay a lot of money for the dome. It's $71 billion they're gonna pay.
Imagine an unsettling hypothetical with me. Russia launches a hypersonic missile from deep inside their borders, and it's aimed straight at Washington, D.C. To get there, it'll have to fly through the Arctic, past Greenland, then over Canada, in order to eventually slam into its target. Now here's the question. How well can the US defend against this attack if it doesn't have Canada's help? Donald Trump is pitching a new missile defense system, made in America to protect America.
I'm asking Congress to fund a state-of-the-art Golden Dome missile defense shield to protect our homeland, all made in the USA.
He has invited Canada to join, but on his terms. Canada's two choices, as he sees it, either pay $61 billion for protection, and just for reference, that's almost 3 times Canada's entire annual defense budget, or join the US as the 51st state.
They have a very small military. They rely on our military. We basically protect Canada.
But when it comes to missile defense specifically, every single expert we spoke to said it's not that simple. And if the US were to try to go it alone, it would be creating all kinds of problems for itself.
What I would say, and if I were advising your nation's leadership, is just present the facts. Canada brings a lot.
When we think about what threats the US is most worried about, Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, they're all on the other side of the world, meaning 2 things. The US needs to be able to shoot down long-range cruise missiles, hypersonic weapons, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they need to consider what direction those projectiles might come from. Could they reach the US by flying over the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans? Sure, but that's hardly the shortest distance. You can shave off around a quarter of that trip if instead of going east or west, you go north.
If you look at a map of the world or a globe and you look at it straight from the north, you can see the most direct path for, let's say, Russia and China is going to go right through the Arctic. It's basically the path by which any attack that comes to North America is going to fly over.
Now, from space, satellites can see a missile launch pretty easily by picking up the sudden blast of heat, but actually tracking the flight path of something hurtling through the air at several times the speed of sound while the Earth is spinning and the satellites are moving themselves. That's a lot harder. So you need ground-based radar in your detection toolkit too. So if we go back to our example of Russia targeting Washington with a hypersonic missile, let me see if I can see it here. So let's say it's launching from right on the Kazakhstan border. And that rocket, that missile, flies over the Arctic Circle and towards Washington, D.C. Most likely the first ground-based radar that'll be able to track it in real time would be in Canada's far north. Meaning Canada isn't just a bystander in a conflict like this, it's the front line.
If you look at just how high latitude a lot of these islands are, it can provide potentially also an earlier warning for potential strikes if there are radar sites or other systems in there.
And we can put some rough numbers to this point about early warning. Let's go back to that scenario where a hypersonic missile is traveling from Russia to Washington, D.C. And let's make some assumptions. First, that the missile is traveling at Mach 8. That's 8 times the speed of sound. And it's traveling at about that speed the whole way. In reality, these kinds of missiles have different flight phases where they can travel at different speeds, but let's just keep it simple. So it's hurtling through the air and then up through space at almost 10,000 kilometers an hour, which is almost 3 kilometers per second. We're looking here at a total approximate flight time of about 56 minutes. A conventional ground-based radar in Canada's north might be able to start tracking that missile about 32 minutes into its flight. So T-minus 24 minutes to impact.
Flight times for a lot of these systems is basically measured in tens of minutes, right? And every minute counts.
But now, imagine that same radar is placed much further south, say near the Canada-US border. At that point, you might not be able to effectively track that missile until it's only about 6 minutes away, which is just moments before its terminal stage of plummeting towards Earth from space at maximum speed.
If you're aware of a threat or a potential threat 2,000 miles away, vice 200 miles away, as a leader of a country, you can pick up the phone and have a conversation with the leader of another country for deterrent effects.
That gives us more decision space. It gives us more options. We want to be able to call out bad behavior and say, we know what you're doing and we have a prepared response for you.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, but the US isn't just the lower 48 states, right? There is northern radar coverage in Alaska, for example, even in Greenland, for that matter. And that's true, but those radar stations only really cover a relatively narrow slice of Arctic approaches. Meanwhile, Canada's northern landmass spans roughly 25% of the Earth's circumference at the Arctic Circle, giving it the capacity to detect threats from many angles.
If you look at the nature of the width that Canada has in the north, in the Arctic, it's a pretty significant gap if we didn't work together with the United States to cover this area.
So yes, Canada's geography makes it invaluable to American missile defense. But of course, it's not just about land. It's about what this country has built and is building on that land. Canada understands missile defense. It's been part of NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, since it was established back in 1958. And by the 1980s, Canada became a key player, pouring serious money into building out a chain of radar stations stretching from Yukon to Labrador.
You have done a lot for since 1958 with NORAD. You know, you funded 40% of the North Warning System, or the systems up front.
Now, those systems, as far as we know, haven't actually ever had to deal with an incoming missile threat. But that's kind of the way it's supposed to work. Missile defense almost being more about deterrence than actually having to intercept threats all the time. And that's not to say they haven't been useful in other ways, too. Just one example, recently spotting both Russian and Chinese bombers flying near Alaska, aircraft capable of carrying dozens of cruise missiles.
Some of what NORAD does, which is to warn of any incoming air threats and aerospace threats, that is going to be part of Golden Dome, because in order to be able to defeat a variety of missiles, you have to be aware that they're incoming.
We are over 60% of the northern approaches is covered by Canada, or more, depending on how you calculate it. Our sensors are pretty vital for being able to detect threats coming from that axis.
And that's especially true when you consider how Canada is investing tens of billions of dollars into new radar systems on its own, with the goal of taking its threat spotting power to a whole new level.
What we need to be able to do is see around the curvature of the Earth as far away as possible, because that's most likely where the launch points are going to be.
Yeah, this is where things get a bit more sophisticated. Most traditional radar systems can only see as far as the horizon, like looking straight ahead on a flat road. But there is another special kind of radar that can see beyond the curvature of the Earth. These over-the-horizon radar systems work by shooting high-frequency radio waves up into the sky and bouncing them off the upper atmosphere back down to the surface. This lets you see threats from thousands of kilometers away. The US currently has one of these systems looking out over the southern horizon, monitoring threats from Central and South America. It's also investing in at least 2 more to keep an eye on the Pacific. But what it doesn't have is one looking north. Canada, though, is building 2 such systems right now.
We've just recently let a contract to build the first set of them. For the foreseeable future, it is probably the main system that we're going to invest in.
According to the Canadian government, these new systems include an Arctic over-the-horizon radar and a polar over-the-horizon radar, both intended to provide early warning radar coverage and expected to be fully operational by 2031 and 2033. Those are expected to give Canada even more lead time over and above the detection capabilities that we calculated earlier.
With the over-the-horizon radar capability, now you're able to see several thousand miles. And so it may be a 10-fold difference in timing that you gain on awareness of the launch platform.
And worth restating, these radar systems don't just detect incoming missiles from further away. It's their ability to see everything else, like a plane flying over the ocean, which might be carrying a hypersonic missile, or a space-based threat orbiting before it drops down into national airspace, or even a missile-armed warship deep in the Arctic Ocean.
Over-the-horizon capability is not just for missiles. It can see maritime all the way to space. So that's a significant contribution to overall domain awareness for potential threats to North America.
Our adversaries are increasingly emboldened. We cannot and should not look first to others to defend our nation.
Now, technically, these systems are still part of Canada's commitment to NORAD. So right now, the US gets access to this tech too. But under the NORAD agreement, each country owns the assets it contributes. So when Canada builds and funds a radar system, it controls how it's operated, who can access the data, how alerts are managed, meaning, despite Trump's claims, Canada clearly does have something to offer besides money or its sovereignty.
As the NORAD commander and NORTHCOM commander, the last thing I wanted to be doing was shooting down missiles over North America. You're much better off deterring in the first place or going after the archer, not the arrow. And so Canada offers a lot when it comes to maritime awareness, airborne platform, and subsea.
Now look, it is important to remember that Canada is still not the superpower here, right? Canada does absolutely rely on American money and might for protection. But it's also true that defending this continent requires Canada's eyes and ears. There's just too much ground to cover. Millions of square kilometers, which makes missile defense in North America a very complex problem to solve. So when Trump drops ultimatums like pay up or become the 51st state, Canada would seem to have at least some room to say, well, hold on, let's talk.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government is expected to vote tomorrow to approve a plan for a full military takeover of Gaza. The United Nations calls reports of the plan deeply alarming. It says such a move would put both Palestinians and the hostages still held by Hamas in further danger. Israel has been facing mounting international pressure to end its nearly two-year war in Gaza, where experts say a famine is unfolding. Hundreds of Israeli former security officials are warning against the military expansion. And our senior correspondent, Susan Ormiston, is following this story for us out of Jerusalem. Susan, what more can you tell us about this plan and the reaction to it?
There's a lot of debate swirling around here over Netanyahu's next steps. In fact, whether he will be able to push through a plan to occupy Gaza entirely militarily over the next period of time. That's apparently what Netanyahu is pushing inside his cabinet. And we do expect that there may be a meeting tomorrow night to discuss that proposal and perhaps a vote. It has created widespread consternation, some opposition, both here in the region and in other parts of the world, including New York, where the UN Security Council talked about this planned move, and the Assistant Secretary General called it deeply alarming were it to happen.
This would risk catastrophic consequences for millions of Palestinians and could further endanger the lives of the remaining hostages in Gaza.
Indeed, the hostage families this morning urged the government not to carry through with that plan, saying it would be a disastrous decision for the hostages, for their families, worrying that any more military intervention inside Gaza will put the hostages at risk and perhaps result in their deaths. At that Security Council meeting, members heard from the brother of one of the hostages, one who was seen in the most recent horrifying Hamas video, showing him standing in what appears to be a tunnel, a completely emaciated frame, causing just horrible pressure and consternation amongst the family, according to their brother.
In that video, my little brother was forced to speak to the world and then actively began to dig his own grave inside a filthy, dark tunnel in Gaza.
There seems to be very little faith now in some kind of negotiated ceasefire or settlement for the return of those remaining hostages, but the families prefer that to carry out, to continue, as opposed to an occupation.
Susan, and as you mentioned, these deliberations are happening over Israel's possible next military moves as Palestinians struggle with famine. You got a chance, you and your videographer were on one of those planes that were dropping aid packets into the territory. What is the update on humanitarian aid and other supplies getting into Gaza?
Yes, on Monday, as you know, Canada delivered its first aid drop using a Canadian military plane over Gaza. And we saw the effects of those types of efforts on the ground as many people rushed to that aid, trying to get their hands on some of it. We're seeing that repeated with truck convoys coming into Gaza. Images in the last 48 hours show swarms of people climbing on those trucks, grabbing stuff off the back, trying to get at whatever they can. It's a very chaotic, increasingly difficult situation, dangerous. And this morning, we are told that 20 people were killed overnight when at least one of those trucks capsized on what Hamas calls a dangerous road and crushed people. Our videographer inside Gaza went to Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City and saw the casualties of that terrible incident overnight. People mourning, one father saying that he'd sent his son to try to get some food, try to get some supplies because they had no other option. In another development, we're seeing that some aid convoys out of Jordan are being blocked just inside the Israeli border. This scene from overnight as Israelis blocked the road. Jordan complained about this morning, saying this is happening more frequently as they try to move aid from Jordan into Israel. So the whole picture suggests that the humanitarian situation is even more complicated, dangerous, and chaotic every passing day, even as there is some more aid getting into Gaza.
Susan, thank you so much for that. That's our senior correspondent, Susan Ormiston, in Jerusalem.
Health officials in China are racing to contain a major outbreak of a mosquito-borne virus that can cause severe pain. 7,000 people have been infected so far, so a campaign is currently underway there to stop further spread of this virus. CBC's Angie Seth has more.
The chikungunya virus has infected approximately 240,000 people in about 16 countries, and there have been 90 deaths. However, no cases in Canada, and Canadian officials are monitoring things carefully. But there are outbreaks to note of. As you can see on the map there are areas of concern. So we're looking at regions around the Indian Ocean. So that includes, as you can see on the map there, Réunion, Mayotte, Mauritius, Madagascar, Kenya, and Somalia, as well as Bolivia, China, and Sri Lanka. We're going to shift our focus to China. That's the area of concern as well. Over 8,000 or so cases there centered around the Chinese province of Guangdong, as well as the southern city of Foshan. Those that have been infected in those areas have been quarantined in hospital until they have a negative test for the virus. And this virus, in terms of symptoms, can cause fever and joint pain. In some cases, that pain can be severe. It apparently does start in the hands and the feet, but it can spread to other parts of the body, and the pain can even last several months. Other symptoms include a rash, fatigue, headache, nausea, and vomiting. And those symptoms can take up to a week or so to appear after an individual has been infected. What is important to note is that this virus is spread by infected mosquitoes, not person to person. So that is an important distinction. Here's more on that.
And in many places, we don't control the mosquito population. So the likelihood is that once it gets from, say, someone who has traveled to China and then, say, back to Singapore or anywhere else, and if they do encounter mosquitoes, it would not be of any surprise that there will be outbreaks that spring up all over Asia, Southeast Asia, and many other parts of the world.
So again, no cases in Canada, but officials are monitoring things carefully. Now, people at higher risk include newborns or infants under the age of a year old, older adults, and those carrying underlying medical conditions. Pregnant women are also an area of concern, and those pregnant women can also pass the virus on to their babies inside the womb. Canada has issued a level 2 travel advisory to those places of concern. And what that means is that they're advising travelers to practice enhanced health precautions. Use, for example, approved bug spray or insect repellent on exposed skin, to also encouraging people to wear light-colored, loose clothing made of materials like nylon or polyester, to wear socks and closed-toe shoes, as well as to sleep under a mosquito netting if you're outdoors or you're staying in places that are not fully enclosed. There is also a vaccine for this virus for prevention, and it is approved in Canada. People are being advised to go to the Canada government website under travel for more information, as well as to get those latest updates. Angie Seth, CBC News, Toronto.
My beloved city just flattened and burned, and with one bomb, 351 schoolmates. They are all burned to death, alive. That kind of unthinkable thing happened. Well, you can't forget that. It's burned to my retina. I have imagery. I was just traumatized. I couldn't feel. Everything I saw that day and in the aftermath, it was a good thing I couldn't respond emotionally, psychologically. If I did, I couldn't have survived. At that time, I felt, well, we have to work to make sure the same thing will never happen again to another human being. Well, I was a teenager, but I knew at that time, that was my resolve. That could happen this moment, or tonight, or tomorrow morning. We are living in that situation. It's getting closer and closer. What does that mean? The loved ones and anything we admire will be all melted down like I saw.